Well, it's definitely an unfortunate side of the hobby, but it happens. In this episode, we are going to dive in and try and dissect what happened to the Hispano Aviation Bull that caused the engine to stop responding. Now, it's fortunate in this day and age with our radio technology and all the technology we use in our aircraft, we've got a lot of data points that we're able to look at to be able to dissect rather than just making some guesses. So this aircraft's been sitting for quite some time, just in a heap. I've taken all the parts out of it. There's a few things here and there left, but it is essentially just a bare airframe at this point. So the purpose of the video is just to try and come up with as much knowledge as possible, and ultimately it would be great if we can come to a conclusion of why. So we've got a few different points to look at. Number one is my recollection of what happened. We'll talk about that first, and then we'll go into the telemetry data. Now we've got different points of telemetry data to look at. Number one, and probably our primary one, is the jetty system. Now, the jetty radio system records all the different telemetry data being received. Now, because we had a V-Speak module in this aircraft, we had all of that turbine data stored in the jetty telemetry. So that is a huge data point where we have probably the most information. The second will be the Swewin telemetry, which probably will overlap with the jetty telemetry, but at least it's a different point that we can look at and compare it to. All right, so let's dissect a little bit about what I remember from what happened. So I had the maiden flight on the Bull. Everything went great. No problems with the aircraft at all. Everything ran spectacularly. Flight number two, now I remember telling myself in my head as it was flying, I remember seeing a couple little smoke trails. Nothing too crazy, not even like anything significant. It'd almost be the difference of like running kerosene or Jet A versus diesel. Diesel, sometimes you see that little smoke trail. So I did my flight in flight number two of the aircraft, and I was starting to get the aircraft full dirty. So gear was down, flaps were down, getting ready to do some landing approaches and get a feel for the aircraft. So I did my pass over the runway and I made my turn in my downwind leg. Now, as soon as I made that turn and I was kind of in front of me, I remember throttling up a little bit and just audibly thinking to myself, I don't have any throttle control. So at that time, I think I went full stick and did not hear any throttle change at all. So immediately I brought my flaps up because the airplane was already starting to get quite slow. When I added that throttle, it was starting to slow down quite a bit. When I realized it, it was a couple seconds later, and you can see the attitude of the plane change dramatically. So I lifted my flaps up, tried to turn to make it back to the runway, and unfortunately the aircraft stalled a little bit past the edge of the runway, and I didn't make it. So there's tons of comments on the original video of the incident, which I will post down below and I'll use snippets of in this video. Now, I appreciate everybody's feedback. It's frustrating for me, but it's very frustrating when you see all the trolls that come out and say, learn to fly, and just all these ridiculous comments. It's really easy to be the keyboard warrior and comment in this situation, but you weren't there. If I would have kept my flaps in the landing flap position, like people commented, the aircraft would have stalled way sooner and would have just fallen out of the sky. If I would have went to takeoff flaps, same thing would have happened. I was already too slow to keep any momentum. So I started dropping the nose and trying to turn the aircraft. So flaps coming up or down really didn't make a difference. Flaps up, I tried to keep as much speed as possible. Now, as far as a engine out, no power situation, that's pretty much the worst position you can be in. Landing slow, full dirty, not a lot of elevation, really, really difficult to recover from. And that brings up what a lot of people said, you should have just put it down straight. Well, that field surrounding the runway had recently been turned over. So it was bare dirt, all loose dirt. And yes, maybe it wouldn't have been this bad, but if I would have just put the aircraft down in the dirt, didn't matter how soft I landed it, the nose gear, main gear would have probably ripped out of the aircraft, and I think a lot of this damage would have happened anyways. So I was going exceptionally slow. The road you can see in the video really wasn't in play. It's quite deceiving because that road is way further than it shows up in the video, so not an issue there. So I have dove in a little bit on my radio to the Jetty telemetry, but not on my computer. So I do have some thoughts going in my head over the past couple weeks, but I, at this point, have not opened any files up in the computer, haven't really done anything to dive into this. So this is really the first view of all of this. Okay, so as mentioned, we have pulled everything out of the aircraft. We've got the Swewin 170 that was in the bull sitting right there, and it actually fared very well. We are going to fire this up and just kind of give it an inspection and check it out. We've got all of our parts from the aircraft, and one of the key things was just how the wiring was laid out and everything. So we have the opportunity to plug this in exactly like it was and check it out. Now the Swewin ECU holds data, but the Jetty telemetry system will also have data. So let's go inside now to the computer and we will get our radio plugged in and start taking a look at the Jetty telemetry from that day of flying. Now, one thing to keep in mind is we're going to look at the first flight, the maiden flight first, just to see if there's any red flags that pop up. And after that, we'll take a look at flight number 2, which is where the issue happened. And we'll take a look at those and see what we can figure out. All right, so we've got all of our information uploaded to Jetty Studio, and we will take a look now at the various items. Now, the first flight we're going to look at with the bull is going to be the maiden flight, the successful flight. And what we'll do is we'll just take a look at some values here, just so we can see. We've got antenna 1, antenna 2, Q value. So we can see here on the graph, this is where everything's shown, that we have good signal strength with our system. We'll make this graph a little bit bigger. There we go. So this is just showing you guys what happened. So this is the duration of the flight basically. We've got, I think, 9 minutes and 20 seconds is where it cuts off. But that's the information for the antennas. So let's cancel this stuff out. And let's take a look at what the turbine is going to look like. Now we've also got the screen open here from the V-Speak manual, and this is telling us all of our different conditions for the status of the V-Speak. So what I mean by that is let's pop the status up here. Okay, so on the graph right now we've got the status of the V-Speak, and what this is going to do is if we put our line here on the graph, we'll do it right at 4 minutes. So at 4 minutes our status is 20, so 20. Now if we go over here to the regular screen for the manual, that means running conditions. So status 20 is running. Now right here where everything drops off real quickly, we can see that it goes into status number 1, and status number 1 is cooling. And that is the whole section right there. So it goes from 20 to number 1, which is cooling. And if we go over here, that's 0, which is stop condition. And then it probably heats up a little bit and goes back into cooling for a little bit. So just to confirm that, let's pop the temperature. And we can see here the temperature overlaying the status. So there's our temperature from the very start, running through the flight, drops down, goes back up above 80 degrees, turbine kicks back in to cool it off, and it drops down. So this is essentially the successful flight, the maiden flight. Everything looks good here, and that is fine. Let's close all this, and I will open up the second flight data, and we can start to examine that. Okay, so we have the second flight all brought up here, and let's start taking a look at this data. So we're going to pop the RX voltage up just to see what goes on here. And this is interesting stuff. Second flight with RX voltage stays pretty consistent. The voltage drops down to 7.6. Sorry, I'm expanding that a little too much. So we see a bit of a voltage drop there, but it's really not that much. We've got 7.9 to 7.6. So that's not overly crazy. And then it stays in that 7.8 to 7.6 throughout the entire span. So those drops look bad, but I don't think they're that terrible. And let's look at our antenna values. So there's antenna 1, and pretty decent. We've got a couple drops down to 3 for antenna 1. This drop there is down to about 2. So that's antenna 1. Let's overlay antenna 2. And we see very similar results with the drops in different areas. So that's fine. So let's remove this stuff. Take a look at our Q value, and that's 100% throughout the entire thing. So that's fine. Okay, we'll take a look at the voltage of the central box for number 1 and number 2. So we see it start off at 8 volts when we first start the flight. And as we go through the flight, it kind of drops to about 7.8, back up to 7.9. And then we do have this drop here at 6, just over 6 minutes. So that's like 6 minutes and 10 seconds. Oh, that's amps. Let's take a look at amps. Okay, so there is our amps throughout the flight. I mean, it really never goes over 2.5 to 3 for pretty much the entire thing. Now, I think this spot right here, this spike, is probably when we went to full flaps. If I had to guess, that's when that spike happened. So that would be like 6 minutes and 10 seconds, or that could have been when the aircraft went in. So we'll remove all that. Okay, so let's start looking at the V-speak status. All right, and this is where things get interesting. And this is what I saw when I was looking on the radio. I thought something was a little bit off with this, so let's take a look at this stuff. So again, we've got our status here, which is 20. And at, oh, the little timer's up top here. So at 6 minutes and 5 seconds, we go to status 21. Now, status 21 is restart. So the engine went into restart mode. So it goes into restart mode and then goes into (13), which is fuel ramp, which is normal. And then it goes to -6, RPM low. So we'll overlay some other information here. So this is the temperature of the engine, pretty consistent throughout the flight. Obviously it here dropped to about 620 degrees, went into restart mode, which is interesting because it didn't sound like the engine failed. So let's still overlay stuff here. So throttle percentage. Yeah, this is interesting. Okay, so zoom in a little bit on the graph. So throttle percentage, this is pretty crazy. So this is 0 throttle percent all the way up to 100. Now this started at 5 minutes and 20 seconds. What's that? 5 minutes and 26 seconds if you look in the top here. So 5 minutes and 26 seconds, it looks like something funky started going on with the throttle. So you can see there was no way that during this time I was max throttle, min throttle, max throttle, min throttle over a 40-second, 50-second window. That's just crazy. So that's something was going on with the throttle channel there. So pump voltage starts off, looks like normal, drops down. So that looks pretty consistent throughout the flight. If we look at our fuel level here, we started off at 3,800, slowly dropped down. So battery started off at 12.1 volts. It dropped at that 6-minute mark, just past the 6-minute mark when things were going crazy when it was restarting, and that dropped to 11.9. So really nothing crazy there. So here's the RPM. You can see there, nothing too crazy as we go across the graph. And again, we approach that 6-minute mark. RPM 60,000, drops right off. So this amperage spike here, that would be when it went into the restart mode. That's pretty typical for when it's igniting the glow plugs, it goes pretty high like that. So the interesting things, the status, the throttle stick are curious. This has me very curious, this section right here, where the throttle channel was going absolutely nuts. If we start to go into some multiple overlays here, it gives us maybe a better idea of what's happening. So on the screen right now, we've got our V-speak status, which is pink. We've got our throttle percentage, which is gray. And we've got our pump voltage, which is kind of the olive color. And if I zoom in here, so you can see that throttle channel absolutely going bonkers. And the pump voltage not responding. That is definitely interesting. RPM follows the pump voltage, which really is what we're looking for there. I mean, the weird thing is that throttle channel, that throttle percentage. So what that throttle percentage is percentage of your throttle stick. So when it's all the way at the top here, it's saying that the stick is at 100% throttle. When it's all the way at the bottom, the stick is at 0. Okay, so blue is throttle percentage, red is RPM. You can see at the very beginning of the recording here, it was already going a little bit nuts. The Maiden flight, again, just kind of knowing all of this and going through all of this data. And this is also curious looking at the Maiden flight. So what we see here is we see a pretty normal run starting off at the 0 mark. And again, this blue is throttle percentage, red is RPM. And you can see that our RPM is pretty much following our throttle percentage. And then we get to like the 5-minute and 30-second mark, and things start going bonkers again with the RPM staying fairly normal, but the throttle percentage is all over the place. That is not very awesome. All right, so just for reference here, this is another one of my aircraft that has a Swiwin 240 in it, and it has the telemetry going from the Swiwin setup into the EXT port on one of the receivers. You can see here this is thrust percent in green, RPM in gray, and this is what we would normally consider seeing here, right? So our thrust goes up, percentage or throttle stick goes up, thrust increases, and that pretty much follows each other the whole time. You can see it's almost a mirror curve all the way, which is to be expected. So this is what a normal flight with thrust percentage, RPM percentage would look like. All right, so part number 2, we have our ECU from the 170 turbine that was in the Bull. That's plugged into our other computer, our Windows-based computer, and so we're doing this a little bit different rather than just doing a screenshot or screen sharing. So this is the data recorded on the turbine. The turbine records the last X number of minutes on the turbine. So this is the very last run where the issue happens. So I'm starting off right here, and we'll slowly go through the entire flight. So this is at 4524.50, and you can see there we're in the ignition phase and preheat, fuel ramp. Now this is all the different stuff on here, okay? Our throttle signal is, you can see there I'm toggling the throttle on and off. So the throttle signal is right there, which is our brown line is what it is. So we've initiated the startup, and we'll try and go through the setup here. So if we go through the telemetry here, you can see everything's basically running fairly normal. We've got a spike there in throttle, 1240. And then we start to get into the flight here. So all of our data is basically showing up there. Now, if you remember on the screen from the Jetty Studio, as we got close to the end of the flight, just going to kind of fast forward there because everything here is quite normal. Okay, so getting close to the end of the flight here, and we're in the running stage. Go into restart rate there. So I don't think this is too crazy. We've got a couple throttle spikes, right? Nothing too nuts, not like the Jetty stuff was showing us. So from the restart point here, we are 53, 52, and we were about 40 seconds, I think. So that brings us to 10 right there. That'd be 30 seconds. And if we go another 10, that's 40 seconds right there. So this, in the Jetty telemetry that we were looking at, this is where all the spikes were going absolutely nuts. Now let's take some of the stuff off. So we'll take our EGT off, ECU temperature, TCU temperature, voltage, battery voltage. We'll leave our throttle on there. RC switch, pressure will take off, current, thrust, pump voltage, pump RPM. So this is just our RPM and our throttle and our switch. Take the switch off because that's consistent. So our throttle stick is the brown one there, and our RPM is the green one. Now the last part of that flight that I did, when I noticed that I had zero throttle response, I was putting the throttle up and down. I did that a few times. So I think that's probably what's showing up there, because we've got like 3 spikes that go up. So that's, I think, probably my throttle stick. Okay, so as we go through this, you'll see that as I mentioned, the RPM will follow the throttle. So we kind of go up here, throttle goes down and down. So what are those dropping to? So that's curious too. We've got our throttle just dropping down. Now that's dropping to 880. which is an off condition. Because RC throttle, that's below idle. Idle's at like 1200-ish. So that is curious, because idle's going to be here, which is 1240. So those two little drops are curious, because this is still the last run. Yeah, and then we get into all the other stuff. So that is definitely curious. So even here, we've got everything, the throttle going down to 880, 880, 880. Huh. Well, that makes things interesting. I don't really know how to read that. So let's go back and see these guys. That's right at the beginning of the flight, right? Because here's our throttle up before takeoff. Let's see if there's any other ones that are dropping like that. So here's the last flight. Yeah, we've got a bunch of drops here as well too. All dropping to 880. Interesting. Well, that changes everything. So, little summary so far. Looking at the Jetty data, I was thinking that maybe it had something to do with the V-Speak module, and the reason I was saying that is because we saw our signal go all over the place. Now, Jetty and V-Speak and Swewin are the only setups, I believe, that you have the throttle channel going through the V-Speak module, which is, when we were looking at the Jetty stuff, I was thinking, sounds to me like it's a V-Speak issue. But now, after looking at the turbine telemetry information, we've got a whole bunch of throttle channel drops in that setup. Now, with Swewin, we're still, everything's running through the V-Speak, so that means all the data is coming from the central box through the V-Speak into the Swewin setup. So still very curious, concerning. Okay, so the software that's being run on this ECU for the 170 is 2.00.92, which is going back a fair ways compared to where we are right now. So there is 2.0092, which is 2020-07-14, and the current software is 2.01.08, which is the newest stuff. So don't know if that has anything to do with it, but I just want to cover all of our bases. Okay, so next thing to look at is our wiring setup. Now we had this wire here, which was our data terminal extension, so that really doesn't play with anything. So the blue lead here plugs into the telemetry port of the ECU, so that's what was in there. You can see all of our wire connectors were good, and this was also gooped into place. If you look at the back of the V-Speak module, that wiring looks a little bit funny. I may pull the shrink tube off just to check. But all of our wiring here looks fine. And we've got this connector here. Now keep in mind these have been through the accident, but we've got that connector. And then our gray wire goes to this connector, this extension that I put on here. Now if you look closely in here, you might be able to see it, but I added another pin on the negative side, which is the far side here. That was just to add more stability to the connector, and then I also put like normal heat shrink around the connector as well. So we will use all this though when we run the turbine again here. Okay, so next step, we've got the turbine set up here exactly how it was set up in the aircraft. So we've got our V-Speak plugged in to our throttle channel. We've got our output port from the V-Speak going into the EXT port on a receiver. And then we've got our blue line going into the ECU. Now what I've done here is I've gone into the setup or study RC screen, and this shows us, I'm going to operate the throttle stick right now. You can see the green number there, shows us our throttle stick position. Now the reason I want to do this is I want to wiggle all the connections and see if that makes a difference. So this is our throttle channel cable. I'm going to go to max throttle and we'll just wiggle all these connectors and see. So nothing there. EXT port cable, nothing there. We'll wiggle the gray connector, single pin connector to the extension. And these guys, I'm pulling on them and moving them around pretty aggressively. Nothing there. The connectors at the V-Speak itself, giving those a wiggle. Giving the V-Speak a wiggle, tapping it, nothing there. And the connections at the actual ECU, giving those a wiggle, nothing. So I don't suspect it has anything to do with loose wiring and all that stuff. Turbine itself still goes into cooling phase. Okay, so we test ran the engine. Everything ran beautifully with it. It didn't skip a beat at all. So what I've done here is taken the ECU while it was obviously plugged in and everything and running. And while it was running, I wiggled all the connections that we already talked about. So let's go plug this back in, take a look at this last test run, which wasn't very long. It was like 2 minutes, and we'll see if anything weird shows up. All right, guys, so here is the last run on the test stand, and honestly, nothing out of the ordinary. It's all very normal stuff. So it starts right here, last run in the aircraft, and then boom, ignition. Everything stays pretty normal. Our brown is our throttle channel. So this long blank section here is where I was testing all the cables. So I was wiggling all the battery connections, everything like that, nothing abnormal. And then go throttle up, and turbine off. So nothing weird at all. Nothing weird. So we got numerous requests for this video about why it happened and the crash investigation. So it's nice to come to sort of a conclusion. So we know that there was a throttle channel issue. The only downside to all of this is I don't know why there was a throttle channel issue. But we can see that because the throttle was going all over the place, maybe the engine got confused, and ultimately that kind of caused the problem. So definitely concerning, gives you something to look for in the future. You know, perhaps you do some ground testing and then you look at the data and see if that's actually happening. Just something to think about, but that ultimately is the crash investigation wrapped up. Doesn't fix anything, time to move on. I've already moved on a long time ago, but it is still disappointing, and we need to have another one of these bulls in the hangar because this was a phenomenal airplane. So thanks guys for watching this video. If you have any questions or comments about this, list them down below. I know people are going to have a lot of different opinions and different insights and views on all this kind of stuff, but definitely, you know, list it down below in the video comments. Happy to read that stuff, happy to interact about it as well. So thanks guys for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.